All right, so let us resume where we left yesterday on this excursus. I mean, I called it an excursus because, again, it's not from Palmieri, but it is part of the course, and you will be actually quizzed on that. So this is actually an important part. So we saw number 9. The purpose of the section was basically to present. To try to present as accurately as possible the teachings of theologians. I don't have, because sometimes people say, you say this because whatever, thesis or not thesis or whatever. No, I just want the truth. I don't care. If I'm wrong, then I will change my position. I want to be with the truth. I don't want to. So in any case, what we try to do is present the teaching as it is, and not as we would like it to be. All right. So that's very important. And then what is disputed, then we have to be honest and say it's disputed if it is disputed. If it's not disputed, then okay, it's not disputed, all right? But the goal is to present things as they are. So number 12, can the Pope fall into heresy as a private person? That is the first question. The question is not about whether or not the Pope as a private person could be mistakenly saying something against the faith. The question is about whether or not the Pope could become a formal, that is, pertinacious heretic as a private person. That is, he knows something already has been defined by the church and he rejects it knowingly. So if a Pope, for example, says, I know Pius IX defined the Immaculate Conception, but I don't care, I don't believe in it, that would be formal heresy, right? It's not just some mistake about something that was defined but he didn't realize or something, or he said it too fast, or no, here it's really he knows what he's doing. That is formal heresy, okay? As opposed to material, where material heresy is just that you're in good faith, but you say something that's heretical. So this opinion has serious value. Oops, I forgot something here. The opinion that it's impossible. So there is something missing here. But the opinion that the Pope cannot fall into heresy has serious value, but since it cannot be certainly proven, theologians still studied the the possible outcome of the hypothesis of a Pope falling into heresy. Saint Robert Bellarmine, and an ardent defender of the papacy and doctor of the church, is of this opinion, meaning of the opinion that the Pope cannot even fall into heresy as a private person. And in his time, he says it's less common. It was less common. Most theologians at his time were thinking that it was possible. But then now, actually, it's as far as I could tell, right, that it seems a lot of theologians think, most likely it will never happen. Typically, whenever they deal with that, I think I told you already many times, but whenever they deal with a situation like that, they think God will never, God will never allow this to happen. It will be incredibly stressful for the church and so forth, and okay, yeah, sure. It's like the apostles saying to our Lord, no, this shall not happen to you. And then, well, yes, I had to go through the passion, So that's the way I feel when I read those theologians. He thus says, so this is St. Robert Bellarmine. So a lot of people say his opinion is the ipso facto depositus. It's only half true, if that is possible, meaning his opinion is actually the Pope cannot fall into heresy. That really is what he thinks. But then he says, but because it's not absolute, so if, however, it is possible, then he will go for his fifth opinion, which is that the Pope will lose the papacy ipso facto, and we will explain that. So he says such an opinion is probable and can easily be defended, as we will show in its proper place. Still, because it is not certain, and the common opinion is to the contrary, it will be worthwhile to see what the response should be if the Pope could be a heretic. So this is from the Romano Pontifici. We have all of those references in the library. We have you don't maybe realize it yet. As a priest, you will realize that whenever you will travel to the seminary, you will enjoy having the library. We have a really great library with a lot of resources, and don't take that for granted. It's not everywhere. So use the opportunity as long as you can to go and check out references, maybe write certain things or copy certain things or whatever. As far as copying those passages from St. Robert Bellarmine and other theologians, I already actually did that. So if you wanted to, I could just you could just make a copy out of what I copied. That would be easier. Also would be better for the books. The two main opinions, number 11, the two main opinions. The different positions of theologians are usually reduced to the following, and you, I'm sure, are aware of that. Number one, the heretical pope is either deposed by the very fact, that is, the fact of being a heretic, and we'll see exactly what that means. Or second, he must be deposed by the church, which in Latin terms is expressed as, for the number one, ipso facto depositus, deposed, namely by the very fact of becoming a manifest heretic, or second, deponendus, to be deposed, namely by the church. But actually, it's usually you won't find actually two theologians who say exactly the same thing. Usually there's a lot of in between. It's a little bit like with the colors, when you have to choose a color when you do some drawing or whatever, you have a whole rainbow, you know, and it goes from one range to the other with a lot of varieties, and it's not just you have, you know, the 7 colors of the rainbow. So here it's a little bit the same, in the sense that you have a number of theologians who are, I mean, I don't know if there are even two that say the same thing, to be honest, in the the details. But, you know, mainly we can categorize them as like that. Thus, the great doctor and bishop Saint Francis of Sales, when addressing this question, merely mentions these two opinions. Now, when he is explicitly a heretic, meaning the Pope, he falls ipso facto, that is, automatically, by this very fact, from his dignity and out of the church, and the church must either deprive him, or, as some say, declare him deprived of his apostolic see. So you see, he puts both opinions there. An improbable opinion: the heretical pope remains the pope and cannot be deposed. So theologians have examined pretty much any possibility you could think of in the study of this question. And so every position has been at some point defended by somebody, pretty much. And since the church has not pronounced on the matter, they adhere to different opinions, presenting different arguments in support of their opinion. So it's a little bit like for matter and forms for ordinations. Before Pope Pius XII settled that, you had all kinds of opinions, as we saw in moral theology. That was a little bit the same here. You had all kinds of opinions. Yes, obviously there are two main ones, and actually the main one is the one of Sandro Beramin, really. But still, you know, you have this one, which is a little odd. An absolutely improbable opinion is that were the Pope to become a formal heretic, he could not be judged or deposed, nor would he lose the papacy. This has been defended by Bouy in his 1869 Tractatus de Papa. We have it right here, so you can check it. This opinion has been universally rejected by the doctors. Speaking about that one, Bishop Salmon says, I think it's because actually he was so much anti-Gallican. Like in reaction, he was a French author, right? But in reaction to Gallicans, he basically went the other, like all the way through. Like, you cannot judge ever, and that's it. Like, even if he's a heretic, just leave him alone. So I think it's because he was so much anti-conciliarism, the idea of the council being over the Pope, that he basically went for that opinion. But in my knowledge, he's the only one who defends that. So it's very peculiar, let's say. So in practical order, it doesn't have much strength at all. This opinion has been universally rejected, as I said, by the doctors. Let us, however, here notice that Bouy defended that in this case, however, and he says it explicitly, black and white, you can check it for yourself, the Pope, although formally a heretic as a private person, would not and could not impose and preach heresy to the church. And actually, it's his arguments is like, well, if he's a private heretic, who cares? In a sense, obviously, it's wrong, right, and it's bad. But he says, at the end of the day, if he were to still be the Pope, he will anyway retain infallibility and all of those things. So, in the practical order, you know, he says it won't be that much of a problem for the church. It will be a greater problem for the church, in his opinion, to try to deal with it, because you need to assemble a general council. But then, you know, what the council will say the Pope is a heretic, but then the Pope is going to probably excommunicate them, and then this and that. Like, how do you deal with this, you know? So that was his reasoning. Yes? Okay. Well, that's a little odd, to be honest. So it's because, I mean, I think he's the only one that, at least that I know of, that holds that opinion. So, despite the different solutions, offer to the theological question of the heretical pope, all theologians do indeed agree that it is impossible for a true pope to impose and preach heresy to the church. So it is, and there's a is missing here. So they all agree on that. So there is no question about that. And I don't expand too much on that, but if you want, I think Saint Robert Beramin and others, they give some arguments against that. Basically, we have the command that's given in sacred scripture to flee from the heretic. So that's from the epistle of St. Paul to Titus, that after one or two monitions, the heretic avoids him. So that means when somebody is a notorious heretic, you should not be in communion anymore with him. That's the idea. That's basically in sacred scripture. The way it is applied, however, is not as necessarily as clear. And theologians basically will say, yes, well, for a time, the church has to do something. Like the Deponendus people, for example, are going to say, yes, this is true, but still, it still has to be done through the church, through the church deposing him. At least we'll see what that means, at least ministerially. But they all follow that principle, basically. But they apply that divine law that we have to flee from the heretic to say that, therefore, the heretical pope cannot stay in office. That's the idea. So the opinion of Bouy goes against that. Number 13, another improbable opinion. It had a little more defenders, though. There were a few of them. But not anymore, I don't think so. So the heretical pope ceases to be the pope by mere internal or occult heresy. So we need to quickly, for the new, at least the younger seminarians, so heresy can be internal and external. If it is only internal, it's I would call it a pure sin. It's not that the sin is pure, sin is impure, but you know what I mean. It's like it's a pure sin, meaning there is no delict because you haven't make it external. Okay? You haven't made it external. Once it becomes external, it can still be occult. That is, it has nothing to do with what we are studying with the other ones in moral theology, idolatry and superstition. No, but it means it's hidden. That's what it means. Okay. And it can be public, means it's known by the public, and then public actually goes further, materially and formally, and that is from canon law. I'm not making it up. Materially, formally. Materially public, it means that the fact that somebody said a heresy is known publicly. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows, for example, Bergoglio said this or that. All right. But formally, that means everybody knows that he is a pertinacious heretic. That is, that in his mind, he's like, yes, I know it's wrong, but I adhere to it anyway. Okay? So this is important. Why? Because, for example, for Canon 1A8 and other canon, this is what you need. And for most Novus Ordo bishops, you can't prove that. It's impossible. Because you would have to say that it is clear to everyone that, yes, this man is definitely a heretic. Not only he says heretical things, but actually, yes, he really means it. He's evil. That's very difficult to prove sometimes. So now, anyway, occult. So here, those theologians, some of them would say internal heresy, and their reasoning was that in order to be the pope, you had to be a member of a church. In order to be a member of a church, you needed to have at least the virtue of faith. That was their reasoning. Obviously, other theologians are going to say, wait. There is the internal communication of life to be a member of a church through faith, the virtues, charity, and so forth. But there is also an external bond, right? So they are going to say that even if you do not have the virtue of faith, you are still a member, at least an apparent member, a visible member. Okay? So we'll see that, and we'll see how Dominicans and the Jesuits do not necessarily explain it the same way here. So for those who have taken De Christo Salvatore, you have seen that Garrigou-Lagrange, for example, he says, against Cajetan actually, because Cajetan disagreed with it, but Garrigou-Lagrange, following Billoir, said that somebody who has lost the virtue of faith per se is not a member of the church, but he is only per accidens externally. So, whereas the Jesuits are going to say, no, he is a member of the church. Occult heretics are members of the church per se. It's only that they do not have the communication of life inside. Yes?
Concerning formal heresy, you have to have a certainty of their pertinacity. Can that only be established in a court, a tribunal, or can that be established?
No, not necessarily. This is more another part on canon law. Well, canon law itself actually explicitly gives the case of presumptions of laws that would happen, for example, if somebody were to join a Protestant sect. So if I tomorrow, let's say you don't see me here and I am in the Methodist Church in the Spring Lake Highway, then you think, like, okay, I guess he's not teaching this morning. Ipso facto, office. So, so that would be already enough, basically. There would be a presumption of law. The same thing applies actually to even Lutherans, even though, if you have a little baby, he's born in a Lutheran family, he knows very little about the faith, but when he is a teenager, if he remains a Lutheran, the presumption of law is against him. So in front of the law, he will be a public heretic, formal public heretic, even though perhaps actually he's only a material heretic, perhaps, if he's in good faith, okay? But he will be presumed to be that way. So there are certain things that automatically makes it presume that you are a formal heretic public. So if you join a sect, so if you leave the Catholic Church, you join a sect, for example, that's actually in canon law. Yes? Idolatry actually makes you suspect of heresy. And normally when you are suspect of heresy, your superior is supposed to send you some warnings, basically, and then deal with you. So then you might, if you do not obtemperate, you might then later on actually get the charge of heresy, properly so-called. But idolatry or participation in false worship makes you suspect of heresy in front of the law. It doesn't make you, it doesn't give you that juridical presumption yet. Yes? Well, sometimes it's going to be very clear because it could be that it is something very obvious, where somebody says, yeah, the church says this and I don't care. Like Hans Kung, for example. It's like the church defined infallibility, but that was wrong. Okay, that's clear. Like he positively says he doesn't believe what the church says. Well, sometimes a lot of the modernists are going to be a little more clever in a bad way, in the sense that they are going to deny something, but then they say, no, I hold what the church says, but then they don't actually. But they, they pretend they believe in the resurrection, but then they say the resurrection means something completely stupid. That's not the resurrection, like Ratzinger and others. So if you ask them, do you believe the Catholic faith? They're going to say yes. But then actually they don't. So sometimes it's going to be very clear because the person, for example, doesn't even claim to be a Catholic anymore. In that case, that's where Canon 188 comes into play right away. So they lose their office. Canon 188 requires basically that it is obvious to the community, not just to you, because, for example, there are a lot of people you might think, oh, definitely this one, he knows what he's doing. But the thing is, that has to be actually public. That's the point. That is, the public has to agree, or in the mind of the public, in the general public, it has to be, okay, this one definitely is a heretic, he left the church. You see? So, and sometimes it's not going to be that clear. And if there is any doubt whatsoever that this is not enough, then it doesn't apply. So that's where sometimes it's a little difficult. Also, even if it does apply sometimes, that's another question, but even if it does apply in certain cases, if the bishop is still in place, let's say if you still have a bishop in place and people actually still recognize him to be the bishop, even if perhaps he would have lost his office through Canon 188, then comes into play Canon 209, which actually supplies his actions, at least according to the letter of the law. Obviously, again, if you apply that to Novus Ordo bishops, Christ, again, cannot supply things that are evil, but at least if you apply the law, that's what the process will be. Is he a public formal heretic in the mind of the people? Some of them probably, some of them I think no. But let's say if there is some, if they are still considered to be the bishop, then you have the Canon 209 that actually makes even valid things that normally should not be valid. Again, the church cannot supply, or Christ cannot supply for things that are evil, though. So it's not that. It's not that clear-cut. Oh, I'm as a private person, I think he's a heretic, therefore he lost everything. It doesn't work really that way. I mean, it's a little more subtle than that. So, yes, Christian.
What's the distinction between a public formal and a public material heretic?
public material is the fact that he said something that was heretical, for example, everybody knows. So you have a headline, Father Dutertre said, Our Lady is not a virgin. Like it's in the newspaper, everybody knows about it. And then I come out 2 days later and I would say, oh, I don't know, I misspoke, or something. Okay. So, but the fact was known. The fact that I would have said that would have been known, but people would be like, yeah, he cannot have said that. I mean, he probably misspoke, So they were not sure whether or not I actually meant it. All right? If it is sure that I really meant it, that I know that the church teaches that and I don't care, then I would be a formal heretic, public. And public heretic in this. Normally, when we say public heretic, we mean formal. Okay. But the problem is the question of the acknowledgement of that fact by the public. That's where the problem is, because for a lot of people, even though our Lord said, "Do not judge your neighbor," still sometimes it's very clear that at least with a more certainty, obviously, eventually you leave the judgment to God. But for some people, for Bergoglio, for example, it's very clear that, in my opinion, that he's a heretic, like formal, like he knows what he's doing. But the problem is sometimes that it's not necessarily everybody that will agree on that. So you might think that, and then somebody will say, no, I don't think so. So it's sometimes that will be a problem. Okay, so let's go back to that. So those theologians thought that internal heresy, or for some others would be external but occult heresy, would be enough to lose the papacy. Despite the fact that the church would not even be aware of this as a consequence, obviously. This was defended by Juan de Torquemada, Alfonso de Castro, this is like they're all from Spain or what? It's a Spain thing, eh? If you are a heretic, you're gone, right? You told me that there was a priest like that, but would just call people heretic, right? In Spain. And a few others, but has been abandoned and refuted by the consensus of major theologians such as Canus, Azor, Suarez, St. Robert Bellarmine, John of St. Thomas, and so forth. So St. Robert Bellarmine explains, quote, jurisdiction is certainly given to the pontiff by God, but with the agreement of men, as is obvious, because this man who beforehand was not pope has from men that he would begin to be the pope. Therefore, he is not removed by God unless it is through men. So now you think, like, wait a minute, I thought St. Robert Bellarmine was ipso facto depositus. Yes, but that's the thing, that for him, it's not the fact that the Pope is a heretic internally, or like he made a sin of heresy, that makes him lose the papacy. It is the fact that the whole church considers him to be a heretic. So it's the recognition of a fact that somebody is a heretic that cuts you out visibly, and therefore you cannot be the Pope anymore. Right? So that's why it comes through men. That is, men have actually to acknowledge that fact. Okay? So Suarez similarly answers this opinion in this way. Against this opinion I say, secondly, in no case, even of heresy, is the pontiff deprived of his dignity and power immediately from God himself without a preceding judgment and sentence of men. So this is from Suarez. Suarez says explicitly that you need to have some kind of judicial declaration or something that indeed he's a heretic, and then that fact makes him lose the papacy. So he's ipso facto depositus, just like Saint Robert Bellarmine, but he does mention explicitly the need of some declaration of being a heretic, basically, so that it's clear for everybody. So then this applies, and then they lose the papacy. In the meantime, for example, Billoir, he's of that opinion that for as long as the church has not declared him to not be the Pope because of heresy, then he would also benefit from, it's not Canon 209, but it's the same idea. That is, Christ would maintain jurisdiction for as long as is necessary for the common good of the church. That's what he says. So, even though he would not be the Pope, really speaking, maybe, he would still benefit from supplied jurisdiction for the good of the church. How could an occult heretic continue to be the Pope? It is common knowledge that one loses membership in the church through heresy, By internal or occult heresy, one loses the virtue of faith, and with it, all the graces called in theology gratiae gratum facientes, so graces given for our personal sanctification, such as sanctifying grace, the theological virtues, the moral virtues, and the gifts of the Holy Ghost. Although still being a member of a church in the eyes of men, one really does not share in any spiritual communication from the church as a private member. Jesuits, with St. Robert Bellarmine, commonly replied that an occult heretic is still a member of a church, since they insist more on the external visibility of a church, although they do recognize that it is so only by an external union. So St. Robert Bellarmine says, secret heretics are united and are members, but only by an external union. So actually, in a way, they kind of say the same anyway. Many Dominicans, such as Billois and Garrigou-Lagrange, but I told you he actually was against Cajetan on that, consider occult heretics to not be anymore members of a church in this sense that they do not even receive from Christ the communication of a virtue of faith. The great theologian Garrigou-Lagrange, in his commentary of St. Thomas Summa Theologiae, explains, and here you have a long quote, the conclusion we must come to is that occult heretics are only apparent members of a church which they externally and visibly profess to be the true church. So if you ask them, are you a Catholic? They will say, yeah. But then, they don't believe in whatever. Much confusion has followed from a lack of awareness of this theological distinction made by theologians. So because Dominicans and Jesuits do not explain it exactly the same way. But you get the sense, though. I mean, they kind of agree. Basically, you have faith is both internal and external, meaning there's a profession of faith that are you a Catholic? Yes, I am a Catholic. Do you adhere to the Catholic faith? Yes, I do. And then you have something internal that is the virtue of faith, right? So in itself, the virtue of faith is more important because really that's supernatural life. So if you do not have faith, you do not have charity either. That means you have absolutely zero supernatural communication from Christ. So therefore, that's why the Dominicans are going to say, well, you're not a member, really, because you will have zero life. Okay, but what is true is that in a case of an occult heretic, you still have that communication outside, external communication. So I get the point of a Jesuit too to say, well, you can consider them members externally only. And usually that's what we mean when we speak about the members of a church, and the Dominicans are going to agree on that. So if you consider things from more like a canonical perspective, let's say, if you speak about canon law, for example, is he a member of a church? Yes, he is. He's a Catholic. He hasn't been put out, so you will say, yes, he is, even though perhaps he's a heretic internally or something. So usually when we consider more the externals. The Jesuits, as we have said, commonly answer the above position by simply explaining that an occult heretic is still a member of a church and therefore can still be its head without any further distinction. For them to answer the opinion of Torquemada is very easy. They just say, well, occult heretics are still members, so they can be the Pope. What is the problem? How then do the Dominicans answer this position, since they would consider that an occult heretic is, strictly speaking, only an apparent member? And here I quote Garrigou-Lagrange. It's a long quote. This condition is quite abnormal, hence it is of no wonder that something abnormal results from it, namely that the Pope, becoming secretly a heretic, would no longer be an actual member of a church according to the teaching explained in the body of the article, but would still retain his jurisdiction by which he would influence the church in ruling it. So he would have jurisdiction, but he would not have the faith himself as a private person. Thus, he would still be nominally the head of a church, which he would still rule as a head, though he would no longer be a member of Christ, because he would not receive that vital influx of faith from Christ, the invisible and primary head. Thus, in quite an abnormal manner, he would be in point of jurisdiction the head of a church, though he would not be a member of it. Obviously, not in the same aspect, otherwise it doesn't make any sense, right? Was it Leo the 13th or Pius the 12th? I forgot which, but one of them said basically you cannot be the head of a church if you're not a member of it, obviously. If that is considered under the same aspect, so if you are even externally you do not even claim to be a Catholic, obviously you cannot be the Pope. That's pretty obvious. So Lutheran, for example, cannot be even elected validly at all, cannot be the Pope. That's very clear. But for the things that are in between, that's where it's a little more disputed. This condition could not apply to the natural head in its relation to the body, so don't try it. But such a condition is not repugnant in the case. Actually, Saint Dionysius proved me wrong. This condition could not apply to the natural head in its relation to the body, but such a condition is not repugnant in the case of a moral and secondary head. The reason is that, whereas the natural head must receive a vital influx from the soul before it can influence the members of its body, the moral head, such as the Pope is, can exercise his jurisdiction over the Church, although he receives no influx of interior faith and charity from the soul of the Church. More briefly, as Billward says, the Pope is constituted a member of the Church by his personal faith, which he can lose, but his headship of the visible Church by jurisdiction and power is compatible with private heresy. The Church will always consist in the visible union of its members with its visible head, namely the Pope of Rome, although some who externally seem to be members of a church may be private heretics. So canonically, though, they are going to be members in front of canon law, but in front of God, they do not even have the faith. This number 15 is, I'm surprised that I actually have to explain that, but I have to. So the debate on the heretical pope is therefore about the crime and not merely the sin of heresy. If you followed the class yesterday, it should be clear now. A crime does require a sin, which is why, it has to be there. It has to be formal. All right. It has to be, you have to be guilty. Okay. But it is important only in as much as it is a crime. Because we said internal, no, even Saint Robert Bellarmine says, no, you don't, that doesn't work. So it's not in as much as it is a crime, it is not in as much as it is a sin internally that will be a problem to receive the papacy or have the papacy or exercise the papacy. It is in as much as it is external, that is a crime. Yes, Eden. Yes. Yeah, sin is between you and God, but the heresy is also a problem for society, whether the church, but it's true also for civil society. So it used to be condemned in Christian faith, right? But it's really in that aspect that it matters in your relation to others. If you are externally a heretic, even if, for example, I think Suarez, in his writings, he makes the hypothesis like, what if a pope would have been judged to be a heretic, and actually he wasn't formally. Like publicly, he appears to be pertinacious, but for some reason, like I don't even think of a possible case, but he makes the hypothesis. What about if actually internally, no, he wasn't a heretic? He said he would still lose the papacy, which is a proof it's not about the sin at all. It's about the perception of it externally. It's really what matters. As Saint Robert Bellarmine says, he's not removed by God unless it is through men. So it is in as much as men are going to see you cutting away from the church. As a consequence of what we have just said, both Jesuits and Dominicans commonly agree that the question of a pope falling into formal heresy is to be taken in consideration only inasmuch as it is a crime, which does, however, presuppose a formal sin. Granted, that's important. Much confusion has been caused by the fact that some people, realizing they could not possibly make the case for the vacancy of the Roman See based on an argument of crime of heresy, we'll see why, have had recourse to the claim that the sin itself would deprive one of the papacy were it to become public. They clearly have overlooked the fact that the sin of heresy, inasmuch as it is external and having external consequences, is precisely what a crime is. So one cannot reject all the church's legislation and the teaching of theologians and canonists under the pretext that one would be speaking of the sin of heresy and not the crime. And as we have seen, theologians commonly reject the idea that a mere sin of heresy would make a pope lose his authority. This happens only when heresy is a public crime. Both Jesuits and Dominicans, to which we may, by a simplification which should not be understood too strictly, apply respectively the opinions depositus and deponendus as explained above, all commonly agree on this point, and it will suffice us to quote a prominent author from both sides. So we can do that categorization, as I said, but it's a simplification. It doesn't really, it's not really true. Like, it's not all Jesuits and all Dominicans. But if we wanted to make it easy, we'll say Dominicans are deponendus, Jesuits are depositus. Pretty much. I mean, it's a little bit like the question of grace. You know, you can say, okay, Dominicans, Jesuits, even though not necessarily. Like, it's not that okay, you are Jesuit, therefore you have to agree with Suarez, no, or Molina or something. You can, one of the Father Mattiusi was an Italian Jesuit, and he was very, very Thomist, and a few others. So it doesn't follow. So anyway, thus the Jesuit theologian Suarez clearly teaches, quote, "We shall later present other offers to support this point when treating the penalties of heretics, and we shall show, in general, that no one is deprived by divine law of any dignity or ecclesiastical jurisdiction on account of the sin of heresy." Meaning, he said culpam, so that is the aspect of the guilt. I should have maybe translated it the guilt, in the sense that the sin when it becomes external, then it's a delict, then yes, is a problem, okay? But if you want to make the distinction, basically, a sin that's external is a delict. So the fact that it is external makes a delict. And you also have the guilt, which is internal, and which you will have to confess. So you have those two aspects, if you want, in that, and it's not necessarily just like equivalent, but so the culpam is not enough, obviously, to make you lose jurisdiction. Similarly, Cajetan explains that the entire discussion is about the crime of heresy. There are different opinions concerning how a pope guilty of the crime of heresy would be deposed. So it's not to be. It's not even disputed, to be frank. 16. The debate between depositus and deponendus has existed for centuries. It's a fact. It has been disputed for a long time. Although certain opinions, I don't know why there is an S here. Although certain opinions presented above have been very rare, so the one of Bouy and the one of Torquemada, the main opposition between the depositus and deponendus schools of thought has existed for centuries. That is, debating whether the heretical pope, once his heresy is manifest, is deposed immediately by Christ, ipso facto depositus, or must be deposed by Christ through the mediation of the church, deponendus. We may broadly apply these opinions to a division between Jesuits and Dominicans to simplify things, although this is not entirely accurate. For example, Juan Azor was actually a very prominent Jesuit, a great theologian at his time. He participated in the in writing the ratio of studies of the Jesuits, and he's deponendus actually. So even more so than Cajetan. He goes further than Cajetan actually, but he's a deponendus and he's a Jesuit, prominent Jesuit. Now I'm sure you probably never heard his name before. At least I did not before doing that research. But he's quoted by a lot of people to this day. Before the Vatican II Council. But Mazzella, for example, Cardinal Mazzella, who wrote here, he basically on that question just refers you to Arthur, and he quotes him, and that's it. Like for him, because he's one of the first to have. No, he's not the first to have addressed that question, but he presented the different opinions and he made his case in a somewhat lengthy way. So he's actually a reference for that. So I was very surprised also to find. So this is Asor, okay? He's quoted by all of them, and then another one who was actually quoted by pretty much, or at least referenced by pretty much all of them as well. And I was surprised is Albano, which I'm sure you know because of what he said, but he actually seems to me considered to be kind of a reference on the question of the relations between the Pope and the Council by a lot of theologians. He's referenced by all of them, So as a major theologian, because he did write about he wrote a number of works on the papacy and the Council and even the Cardinalate. Like he has a book literally entitled De Cardinalatu, so on cardinals. So he's one of the authors that has written a lot about that. Okay, so I lost myself again. All right. There exists a whole array of opinions on both sides, which are not entirely the same on every point. So again, think about the rainbow that I spoke about. Like you have main colors, all right, but you have a lot of colors in between. That's the same thing here. But before we explain precisely the import of each opinion, let us first prove that this debate has indeed existed for centuries by quoting here a number of prominent theologians who have written on this question in the past. And the reason I'm doing that is because some people have said, oh, no, it's not disputed, everybody agrees on this and that. Well, the fact is it's not true. So, in 1513, the camps were not yet as clearly defined, and many other opinions were also taught. So you had more than two. You had a lot of. Also, you have still conciliarism going around a little bit that needed to be refuted. But Cardinal Cajetan clearly indicates the existence of these two opinions. He says, quote, "There are different opinions concerning how a pope guilty of the crime of heresy would be deposed. And this is, in other words, what is said by others, that when the Pope becomes a heretic, he is deprived of the papacy automatically," he uses the word ipso facto, "by the divine law by which the faithful are distinguished from the infidels. And when he is later deposed by the church, it is not a Pope who is judged and deposed, but he who is already judged, since he does not believe according to the word of our Lord in John 3, and he who is already deposed, when by his own will he became an infidel and left the body of the church, he is declared judged and deposed." So he presents here the ipso facto depositus opinion, which means he's deposed by Christ, and then the church will only declare the fact that the Pope is no longer the Pope, basically. And then in another place he says, "Although the said opinion is defended by illustrious men and seems common, it does not please everyone," himself in particular. "It is contradicted by two other propositions. One of them is the conciliarism, which obviously he will reject. But the first is that the heretical pope is not automatically ipso facto deposed, but is to be deposed." In 1588 appears the magisterial work of St. Robert Bellarmine, in which he famously exposed five opinions, of which the three have already been presented and left aside, while the fourth and fifth are the two opinions which we are now considering. So he says, the fourth opinion is that of Cajetan. There he teaches that a manifestly heretical pope is not automatically, ipso facto, deposed, but can and ought to be deposed by the church. And then later on he says, now the fifth true opinion is that a pope who is a manifest heretic ceases in himself to be pope and head, just as he ceases in himself to be a Christian and member of the body of a church, whereby he can be judged and punished by the church. So St. Robert Bellarmine here presents both opinions, but also notice that it's interesting what the way he explains his opinion is that basically you lose the papacy in the same way as you lose membership in the church. So everything that we said about all of this will also be the same for the papacy, basically. So if you are considered to not be a member of the church anymore in any way whatsoever, then you are not the Pope anymore. In 1600, so here is Arthur, he already reduced the debate to two main sentences. There are two opinions. The one affirms that he, the Roman pontiff that has fallen into heresy, loses indeed the papacy by divine law, although he is afterwards declared by the sentence of the church to have fallen from the pontifical dignity because of his crime of heresy. So that's ipso facto depositus. Notice that they all say that you still need the declaration afterwards, though. The second opinion denies that the Pope who simply becomes a heretic is removed by divine law from his power and the dignity of his jurisdiction, but that he must be removed, and he actually will follow that. So I put a footnote here saying, although not very famous in our days, Arthur, or Azor, whatever, is universally recognized as an important authority on this question and referenced by all the great authors. Which is why I actually went and because we don't have his books, however, but it's actually you can find it online. So if you like to read all Latin, we actually, I printed a few pages and you see it's like all print whatever, because it's nowhere to be found anymore, at least to my knowledge. But you can still find it online though. So he wrote a big work of moral theology, and that's actually discussed in that work. Azor follows the Deponendus opinion, explaining that the heretical pope needs to be declared guilty of the crime of heresy and deposed. So. Although he's a Jesuit, although he comes after Saint Robert Bellarmine, he was of this opinion. Sometime in the beginning of the 17th century, so I could not find the exact date for that, but the great doctor Saint Francis of Sales, who died in 1620, was able to summarize the question thus, quote, "Now when he is explicitly a heretic, he falls ipso facto from his dignity and out of the church, and the church must either deprive him or, as some say, declare him deprived of his apostolic see." In 1622 was published the teaching of Suarez, who explains how he disagrees with Cajetan in a similar way that Saint Bellarmine did, despite a clear agreement on the essentials. So this is important, we'll see that later on, but actually the dispute which became very famous between Saint Robert Bellarmine and Cajetan on that question is about a very small detail. Saint Robert Bellarmine says the same thing as Cajetan on a lot of things actually. So it's only on that little thing as to how to explain to explain how the Pope will lose the papacy. Basically, that's all. But we'll see. But otherwise, he agrees on the essentials. So in any case, this is Suarez here, quote, "But now a third doubter is raised." So notice that's the third one. That means we already, in the mind of Suarez, we already went through, okay, there is either this or this, then there is either this or this, then there is either this or this. So Cajetan and Saint Robert Bellarmine made it all the way through together right there. And it's only here that they disagree, okay? So in the exposition of Suarez. He says, "Now a third doubt is raised. By what right can the Pope be judged by this congregation, since he is superior to it? In this matter, Cajetan surprisingly complicates himself," that's what Suarez says, "se mire vexat." So he's like, "Oh, come on, you did so well until now. What did you make?" But all of those authors, I mean, it's incredible. Like, I was very astonished by how how much they actually wrote about that question. Like, it's pages and pages and pages, whether Cajetan or Suarez. Saint Robert Bellarmine actually is the one who has written probably the less on that, because it's very short. It's just one, and it's only for one thing. We'll see. Okay. Check. In 1643, John of St. Thomas, a prominent Thomist Dominican, presents different opinions, among which are found the same two prominent opinions, which he explains as actually agreeing on the essentials, as we shall see later, but as disagreeing in the mode of deposition of the Pope. And secondly, with regard to the deposition itself, so here for him is secondly, so I guess it's a little further. Secondly, with regard to the deposition itself, which happens after the declaratory sentence of a crime, a difficulty remains, whether it be done by the power of the Church, or rather by Christ the Lord himself, supposing the declaration. So that's interesting. This is how he presents the ipso facto depositus. He does not exclude some process of the Church, and we will see that Saint Robert Bellarmine does not exclude that either. The footnote says, "Let us here notice that according to John of St. Thomas, the difference of opinions between Saint Bellarmine and Cajetan is only about this last detail concerning the mode of a deposition, and explains this explicitly in the number 20th of the same chapter, where he confronts the two opinions. This observation will be confirmed further below." So what I'm going to show you actually is that in a practical order, Cajetan and Saint Robert Bellarmine can be followed pretty much the same way. That is, how do we deal with a heretical pope? You will see Saint Robert Bellarmine actually explicitly speaks about the general concept. So it's really a speculative question as to how it works, basically. So it makes me think about the question of grace. The question of grace is, you have God, everything good comes from God, and then you have free will. And you have somehow to reconcile those two things in the question of grace, okay? How grace works. You have to reconcile those two things, and you know that the Jesuits and Dominicans, they disagree, but it's very speculative though. In the practical order, they both pray. I mean, whether you are a Jesuit or Dominican, you pray, you act as if it depends on you as far as making efforts, but you pray to God, and you act as if everything depends on prayer. So you keep both sides, actually, in the practical order, you see what I mean? It's more like a speculative theology question. So here, it's actually kind of the same. That is, somehow you need to have the, well, I guess I'll keep God here. And you have the church. St. Robert Bernard said explicitly that somehow there has to be some recognition by the church that this man is a heretic, right? We saw that already. Occult heresy is not enough. So it's only a consideration of those two things as to, okay, how is the papacy lost? But it's very speculative in practical, in itself. It's, in the practical order, you will see that if they were both to face a heretical pope, they would actually act the same way. They would ask for a council to be gathered and basically, okay, recognize the fact that this man is a heretic and now he's not the pope. Whether you say we are actually taking his authority away or no, it's actually God doing it, but we are just saying he's a heretic. Okay, at this point it's just speculation. You see what I mean? So that's very important to understand. Okay. All right, so we will resume at number 17 tomorrow. So this is taking a little longer than expected, but it's very important. So for today, it's a very relevant question. Obviously, you will have to deal a lot with that. So.